We can now begin the final lecture topic. The time period to be discussed will be from 1981 to 2005. This lecture will investigate the highlights of several recent presidential administrations. These include Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. As you're going along, you may want to think about the accomplishments of each presidential administration and determine which individual you believe had the biggest impact on this era. We'll go ahead and start with some background information concerning Ronald Reagan. The figure of Ronald Reagan dominated the political scene in the decade of the 1980s. He was a familiar face to many Americans as he made over 50 movies during his acting career. He started his political career late, but served 2 terms as California governor and demonstrated he was a political force with his ability to connect with average voters. Kennedy may have been the first president to effectively use television, but Reagan became the great communicator. As a politician, he combined a blend of optimism and patriotism which declared to many that the United States was definitely not becoming a second-rate world power. In 1980, Ronald Reagan and President Jimmy Carter engaged in a series of televised debates, and Reagan came out the winner. At one point, he looked into the cameras and asked a simple question: "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Unfortunately for Carter, most Americans were not better off after his 4 years in office. Reagan won handily with nearly 51% of the popular vote to Carter's 41%. Once Reagan became president, he implemented his vision on the nation. I'd like to talk about that now. While critics pointed out Reagan's weaknesses when it came to specifics, the overall vision he had for the nation was always quite clear. His set of policies came to be known as Reaganomics. First, he called for smaller government and would bring this about by cutting taxes and spending. Secondly, he argued that communism was wrong and must be fought, demonstrating he was an ardent Cold Warrior. He also argued that if his policies were adopted, the U.S. economy would revive and the budgets would be balanced. Well, let's look at the reality of Reaganomics. First of all, we see a huge tax cut as Congress reduced taxes 25% over a period of 3 years. Over $40 billion in domestic spending was also cut for programs involving school lunches, student loans, mass transit systems, and other areas. He also labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire, and defense spending nearly doubled by 1985. After a recession, the overall economy grew dramatically by 1983. Nixon and Carter had tried to curb inflation in the 1970s, but Reaganomics brought it under control. However, the budgets weren't balanced, as the deficit skyrocketed, while poverty increased in urban areas. Reagan surprised many of his critics with the vision he developed during his second term dealing with foreign policy. Seemingly against all odds, Reagan forged a close and cordial relationship with the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. The two men met on several occasions, which led to an easing of tension in the Cold War. Probably the most important result of these meetings was the INF Treaty. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and Soviet Union was signed in 1988 and was a tangible demonstration of an additional thaw in the Cold War. It involved about 2,500 American and Soviet nuclear missiles which were removed from Europe. The weapons were then destroyed. Reagan had come a long way from his characterization of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Reagan's popular image was threatened by a scandal in the later 1980s. During his second term, Reagan's image was damaged when news of the Iran-Contra affair became public in 1987. In a series of televised hearings, Americans learned that Reagan officials had shipped weapons to Iran. They did so in an attempt to obtain the release of hostages held in Lebanon. For a president who vowed not to negotiate with terrorists, this was a damaging blow. Furthermore, it was discovered that the money used from this arms sale was diverted illegally to fund the Contras fighting in Nicaragua. The subsequent investigation criticized Reagan's management style. However, more blame was placed on Reagan's aides than on the president himself. Reagan continued to remain popular among the American people, prompting critics to label him the Teflon president, as criticism just didn't stick. We will now investigate some more recent presidential administrations, and we'll start with President George H.W. Bush. In the fall of 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, was elected to the White House. In doing so, he became the first sitting vice president to be elected to the presidency since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Less than 1 year after having become president, Bush oversaw the end of the Cold War. Probably the most important symbolic event signaling the end of the Cold War came in the fall of 1989. The Berlin Wall was first erected in 1961 and was a literal concrete reminder of the division between communist and democratic governments in Europe. In November of 1989, citizens, like the man shown here, began to tear it down. By the end of the following year, the demolition was complete. Russian control over their satellite nations in Eastern Europe also faded as the Soviet economy faced crisis. By the time Gorbachev resigned in late 1991, most of the Soviet republics had already declared their independence. This impacted the U.S. military. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney proposed a 25% decrease in U.S. military forces. The confrontation which had dominated American foreign policy and society in the years following World War II had finally come to an end, with the United States victorious. In August of 1990, President Bush faced an unexpected crisis in the Middle East when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded the neighboring nation of Kuwait. Bush sought to remove Iraq from Kuwait and worked slowly within the United Nations to develop a coalition of countries to help. After trying economic sanctions, Bush asked for the authority to use force. In a very close vote, Congress granted Bush this power in January of 1991. The United States began with heavy bombing raids in mid-January. By late February, 200,000 ground forces were deployed in what came to be known as Operation Desert Storm. The Iraqi resistance was crushed, and Bush declared a ceasefire soon thereafter. The image on the left shows American soldiers in Iraq. While American troops forced the Iraqis out of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein still remained in power. At home in the United States, there was some opposition to the war, but following the short ground war, President Bush enjoyed near unprecedented approval ratings that hit an amazing 88%. It appeared as if he would be unbeatable as he stood for re-election in 1992. Next, we'll discuss the presidential election of 1992 and Bill Clinton's years in office. Bush may have appeared unbeatable following the Iraq War, but the U.S. economy was in recession later in the year. Economic troubles plagued his administration thereafter. The Democrats chose Bill Clinton, another Southern governor, to run in 1992. He blamed Bush for the economic woes and problems facing the middle class. We also see the emergence of a third-party candidate, Texas billionaire Ross Perot. On the right, we see all three candidates in one of their televised debates. In the end, Clinton won with 43% of the popular vote. However, it's important to note that Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote, which is more than any third-party candidate had won since the 19-teens. On the left, we see the electoral map from the 1992 election. Clinton's presidency got off to a rocky start. A controversy erupted when he attempted to fulfill a campaign pledge allowing for homosexuals in the military. The ensuing compromise of "don't ask, don't tell" allowed him to save face, but he lost a great deal of political capital. Clinton also appointed his wife, Hillary, to head a task force investigating health care reform. When their report, which called for universal coverage, was published, it went nowhere as several interest groups strongly opposed the plan. One area where Clinton did see a measure of success in the long run was with the economy and the federal budget. The first budget he submitted to Congress was directed toward lowering the deficit in the near future. In later years, he fought over the budget with a Republican-controlled Congress and leaders like the House Speaker, Newt Gingrich. On more than one occasion, the government was shut down, but Clinton emerged from the budget wars as the victor. Later in the decade, Clinton would take credit for not only balanced budgets, but budget surpluses. On the left, we see the celebration surrounding Clinton's balanced budget bill from 1997. The U.S. economy was strong for most of the 1990s, as we can see from this figure outlining levels of unemployment. With a high of 7.5% in 1992, it fell to about 4% by 2000. The stock market also experienced tremendous growth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was at about 3,000 in 1991, but by 2001 it hovered close to 12,000. The high-tech emphasis and dot-com revolution in California's Silicon Valley and Western Washington seemed to be the wave which would carry the United States into the next millennium. As we can see from this figure, gross domestic product increased steadily throughout the decade as well. While all of these figures show robust growth, there were still many holes in this new economy. As seen with this figure, one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy was the service industry, which included many low-paying, low-skilled jobs in retail stores and fast food restaurants. The job market increasingly called for workers with high levels of skill. People born into poverty often did not have the resources to better their education and obtain those skills. Also, while the jobless rate of African Americans and Hispanics lowered in the 1990s, they remained significantly higher than those rates for whites. Overall, the gap between the poor and wealthy in America grew even wider during the decade. Next, I'd like to talk about the background to and impact of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. For years, Clinton had been surrounded by reports of marital infidelity. Well, after assuming the presidency, Clinton was accused of sexual harassment by Paula Jones. During the investigation into the case, it was learned that the president had carried on an affair with a 21-year-old White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Clinton was subpoenaed. He denied the charges under oath and in public. Only later did he admit to what he called an inappropriate relationship with Lewinsky. In the fall of 1998, Bill Clinton became only the second president in U.S. history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He was faced with two charges, perjury and obstruction of justice, both of which stemmed from the allegations associated with the Lewinsky scandal. A trial in February of 1999 followed, after which the Senate voted. In the end, there was no two-thirds majority vote to remove Clinton from office, but his public image and political clout had suffered dramatically. Surprisingly, Clinton's approval ratings actually increased during the impeachment crisis. The public didn't condone his behavior, but saw his impeachment as a political attack on what was actually a private, personal matter. Many Democrats asked, what could have been? With the soaring economy, relative peace abroad, it seemed as if missed opportunity would characterize Clinton's years in office. Unfortunately, the deep flaws in his own personal moral character ruined any chance of major reform in Clinton's second term. George W. Bush followed Clinton into the White House. We'll explore the election of 2000 and highlight several aspects of his presidency next. The 2000 presidential election pitted Republican George Bush, the governor of Texas, against Democrat Al Gore, the former senator and current vice president for Clinton. Both were baby boomers, and each had come from powerful families. Bush's grandfather was a senator, and his father had served as president. Gore's father had been a senator from Tennessee. The election proved to be one of the closest in U.S. history, and it was uncertain who had won for several weeks. The day after the election, there was no clear winner in the Electoral College. The vote was very close in several states, but it appeared as if the results of the election would hinge on the key state of Florida. Several problems plagued voters in Florida. First, a confusing ballot in Palm Beach County seemed to lead several Gore voters to vote for Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan by mistake. Poorly maintained punch card voting machines also led elections officials to throw out ballots in several counties, which included a high proportion of poor and African American voters. Gore sued to obtain a recount of these ballots. On the right, we see an elections official scrutinizing one of these partially punched ballots. When Florida's state Supreme Court allowed the recount to continue, Bush appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The results of their final appeal were announced in a 5-4 decision handed down on December 12th. Bush won the presidency as the Republican appointees generally supported Bush. The next day, Gore conceded. For the first time since the 1800s, one candidate had won the popular vote, and the other had won the electoral vote. On the right, we see the electoral map from the 2000 presidential election. Bush had some early successes following his electoral victory in 2000. This was seen with the passage of his education plan entitled No Child Left Behind. This program emphasized standardized testing in public schools. He also succeeded in getting Congress to pass a large tax cut in 2001. Overall, however, critics charged the administration lacked an overall vision for the nation as the economy headed toward recession and budget surpluses disappeared. However, The key event which would define the Bush presidency came with the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon on September 11, 2001, and President Bush's responses to those attacks. Some argued that he found his voice with a bullhorn in his hand as he visited Ground Zero in the days following the attacks. Within just a few days after 9/11, Congress granted President Bush the authority to use all necessary and appropriate force to respond to the attacks. Later, Bush addressed Congress and blamed the attacks on the al-Qaeda terrorist network operating out of Afghanistan headed by Osama bin Laden. On the left, we see President Bush with key members of his national defense team. The group worked together to draft a response to the terrorist attacks. There were a variety of responses undertaken by the White House. First, the Bush administration proposed, and Congress then passed, the USA Patriot Act, which expanded the government's powers to monitor people's lives and fight terrorism. In October of 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan in an attempt to uproot the Taliban regime, which gave refuge to al-Qaeda. Also, after initially opposing its creation, Bush bowed to pressure to create a new cabinet-level office of the Department of Homeland Security. In his 2002 State of the Union address, President Bush labeled Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as the axis of evil in the modern world. He further argued that Saddam Hussein posed a threat to world peace and that Iraq's leader had access to weapons of mass destruction. The United Nations then imposed economic sanctions and called for the return of inspectors, but did not authorize force against Iraq. Following Hussein's resistance to the inspectors, Bush sought and received the authority from the United States Congress to invade Iraq. In March of 2003, more than 100,000 American troops invaded Iraq. The capital of Baghdad fell in April. Later that year, in December, Saddam Hussein was captured by American forces. Although President Bush had previously declared an end to major combat operations in Iraq, conditions worsened in 2004. By September of that year, bombings, kidnappings, and highway explosions occurred on a daily basis, and the American death toll increased as the United States headed toward another presidential election. 2004 saw another close presidential election battle. This time, President Bush ran against Senator John Kerry. Kerry criticized the president's war on terror and accused the administration of misleading the country about conditions in Iraq. In the end, President Bush was re-elected to another term in the White House, however, by a margin of about 51 to 48%. This lecture has highlighted about 25 years of recent American history. There are many things which can be evaluated from this era. Several different presidential administrations have been discussed in this lecture. Each man who occupied the Oval Office left his own mark on the nation. Maybe you would like to evaluate the actions of each of these individuals. Overall, which president do you believe had the most positive impact on the nation during this era? Well, this concludes the final lecture, From Reagan to a New Century. The next few slides will offer hyperlinks for additional information, as well as sources used for writing this lecture. Have a great day.